Hey there, Pages of Darkness fans. You know, addiction can take many forms. There's drinking, drugs, gambling, and then there are the types of addiction that can be forced onto you by a supernatural force. Mainly this, the Devil's Elixir. I'm going to tell you a story about a man who struggled with the Devil's Elixir, and that story can only be found right here in the Pages of Darkness. I'm going to read for you that story right now. Let's begin, shall we? Hey there, my name's Henry. I'm 27 years old. As I sat there in a bar not far from my brother's house sweating profusely, I kept checking the clock at regular intervals. It was like my brother to be late, or sometimes not even show up at all. But let's just say my brother had a bad drug history, and we didn't really say eye to eye much. He called it his way of coping, of dealing with the death of our parents, which happened 10 years ago. I called it a problem. I called him a problem. But I needed him here and now. The bartender slipped me another drink. It was only a light beer, but I needed something, anything to take my mind off the thing that had control of me. I heard the swing of the bar doors as the breeze blew in with someone's entrance. I turned around to look at the door, and there he was, pale, thin, and looking like a train wreck. "Over here, Harry!" I waved my hand while shouting across the room. Harry saw me and smiled, then proceeded to take a seat at the bar, giving me a stern pat on the back.
"I didn't expect to get a call from you after the way we left things last time."
Harry held his hand up to the bartender and he slid Harry a beer. "How you been, Harry?" He cut me off.
"Look, unless you're going to start with an apology, I don't want to hear it, Henry."
I turned to my twin brother with tears in my eyes. I'm sorry, Harry. I'm so sorry." Harry looked at me with a mix of fear and worry etched in his face. He'd never seen me in such a bad way.
"Jesus, what happened to you, Henry?"
I took another swig of my beer and gulped it down hard. "I'm going to tell you a story, Harry. One that I'm not even sure I believe. It all takes place about a week ago. There I was. I just made my law firm a lot of money on a big case. Like a lot of money. A landmark case that would have my name circulating in the right circles for years. The senior partners practically dragged me to a party that night. 'Celebrate your success,' they said. 'This is how you get to the next level.' The party was held in one of those sprawling mansions you only see in magazines. The kind where the air smells expensive and everyone pretends like they belong. I was good at pretending. Shaking hands, flashing smiles, making the rounds like I wasn't dying to leave the moment I walked in. That's when I noticed him. He wasn't like the others. While everyone else preoccupied with showing off their wealth or whispering about business deals, he stood off to the side, watching. His suit was pristine, a deep burgundy that shimmered unnaturally under the chandelier. He didn't try to blend in. He didn't need to. His presence alone was enough to command attention. At first, I ignored him. But he didn't ignore me. I'd catch him staring from across the room, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. When our eyes met, it wasn't curiosity of politeness. It was as if he already knew me. Eventually, he approached, his movements fluid, his gaze unyielding. "Henry," he said, his voice smooth and deliberate. I froze. "Do we know each other?" He ignored the question. "You've done well for yourself. Your parents would be so proud." It hit me like a gut punch. I hadn't told anyone at that party about my parents. Hell, I avoided talking about them altogether. "Excuse me?" "You think of them often, don't you?" he continued. "Their faces, their voices, but it's all slipping away, isn't it? No matter how hard you try to hold on." I wanted to walk away, to tell him off, but I was rooted to the spot. There was something in his tone, something almost hypnotic. "What are you getting at?" I asked, my voice colder than I intended. He smiled slow and knowing and reached into his pocket. When his hand emerged, he held a small glass vial. The liquid inside was dark, almost black, and it shimmered like an oil slick under the light. "This," he said, holding it up between two fingers, "is the answer to everything you've been missing." I stared at the vial, my stomach twisting. "I'm not interested," I said firmly, stepping back. He chuckled softly, tucking the vial back into his pocket. "Suit yourself, but you'll change your mind. They always do." I left the party after that, but his words stuck with me. His voice, his confidence. It was like he'd seen straight through me. A few days later, I found myself at another event. This one was different, less polished, more eccentric. It wasn't my usual scene, but I told myself it was good networking. Or maybe I just didn't want to be alone. That's when I saw him again. He wasn't mingling with the crowd. Instead, he stood in a dim corner, speaking to a woman. She was thin, frail, with dark circles under her eyes and trembling hands that clutched a glass like it was the only thing keeping her upright. I watched as he handed her the vial. She snatched it eagerly like a starving person offered food. She fumbled with it, her desperation almost pitiful, and when she finally managed to tip a drop onto her tongue, her entire body shuddered. At first, her face twisted in pain, her eyes wide and unfocused. Then, slowly, her expression softened. Tears streamed down her cheeks and she let out a choked laugh.
"It's them.
She whispered, her voice cracked and uneven.
I can feel them. They're here."
She clung to him, sobbing into his shoulder, and he held her like a father comforting a child. It was grotesque. My stomach churned with a mix of disgust and something I didn't want to name. She wasn't happy. She was addicted. This wasn't joy, it was dependency. I turned to leave, but there he was, as if he had teleported. "You're curious," his tone as a matter of fact. "Look, I told you I'm not interested," I snapped, anger bubbling to the surface. "Not yet," he said, his smile infuriatingly calm. "But you will be." He pressed the vial into my hand before I could stop him. "Take it. Keep it. When you're ready, you'll know." I wanted to throw it back in his face, but I didn't. I don't know why. Maybe I was too angry, or maybe I was too scared. I shoved the vial into my pocket and left. That night, I sat in my apartment, staring at the tiny glass bottle. I told myself I wouldn't touch it, that it was better than that. Better than him. But the longer I stared, the louder the whispers became, and eventually I caved. I tipped a single drop onto my tongue, and that's how I got there. The room swirled around me, colours bleeding together until they settled into shapes. My grip on the armchair tightened, my knuckles wide as the voices grew louder.
Henry.
It was soft, tender, like a distant echo. But I knew that voice. My stomach churned, my breath catching in my throat. "Mum?" I scanned the room, or wherever I was now. The ornate walls of my apartment had melted away, replaced by something familiar yet alien. I was standing in the living room of our old house, the one I hadn't set foot in since they died. And yet, there they were. My mother, sitting on the couch, her hands folded neatly in her lap, wearing the lavender dress she used to love. My father stood behind her, one hand resting on her shoulder, his face solemn but warm. They looked alive, whole.
"Henry,"
my mum said again, her voice filled with that unshakable patience she always had. I stumbled forward, my legs shaky. How is this possible? You're gone. Is this real? She tilted her head, her smile faint but filled with understanding.
"Oh, Henry, you've always been here. You just weren't looking hard enough."
I looked to my father, who nodded silently, his gaze heavy with something I couldn't name. Love, maybe, or possibly regret. Tears pricked at my eyes. I missed you so much. There's so much I wanted to say, so much I didn't get to. It's okay, my dad interrupted, his voice steady and reassuring. We know. I dropped to my knees, my chest heaving. I tried to make you proud. I worked so hard. But I don't know if it was enough. My mum reached out, her hand brushing my cheek. It felt warm, real.
You've always been enough, Henry, but you've forgotten what matters.
What do you mean? I asked, my voice trembling. They exchanged a glance, something unspoken passing between them. My dad stepped closer, his hand gripping my shoulder firmly. Family, Henry. It's all we have. It's all we leave behind. I opened my mouth to argue, to tell him that I had a family, my success, my achievements, but the words died in my throat.
You're still holding on to the pain.
My mum said gently.
It's time to let it go, to forgive.
Her words cut deeper than I expected. I thought of Harry, his gaunt face, his sunken eyes, my disgust for him, the way I pushed him away. I don't know if I can, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. You can, my dad said firmly, and you must. The room began to blur again, the edges of their faces softening. Panic surged through me. Wait, I cried out, reaching for them. Don't go, please. Don't leave me. My mum smiled sadly.
We're always here, Henry. You just have to remember.
And then they were gone. The room snapped back into focus. I was in my apartment again, clutching the empty vial in my hand. My chest heaved as I gasped for air, the weight of their words pressing down on me. I stared at the vial, trembling. It wasn't just a drug. It was a doorway, and I wasn't sure if I was ready to step through it again. At first, it was a dull ache in my head, like the hangovers I used to get in college after a few too many beers. But this wasn't just a hangover, it was worse, so much worse. It hit me all at once like a tidal wave. My stomach churned violently and a cold sweat broke out across my skin. I stumbled towards the bathroom, barely making it to the sink before I dry heaved, my body convulsing as though it was trying to expel something that wasn't even there. My vision blurred, and my legs felt weak beneath me. I gripped the edge of the sink, staring into the mirror. My face was pale, my eyes bloodshot, and my skin glistened with sweat. What the hell was that? I rasped, my voice barely audible. The pounding in my head grew louder, echoing like a drumbeat. My heart raced, erratic and relentless, as though it were trying to claw its way out of my chest. I felt disconnected, like my body wasn't my own anymore. Then came the shaking. My hands trembled uncontrollably, and I couldn't steady them no matter how hard I tried. It wasn't just physical, it was something deeper, something wrong, like my body knew it had been poisoned, and it was fighting to survive. I stumbled back into the living room, collapsing onto the couch. The world spun around me and I clutched the cushions like a lifeline. My breath came in ragged gasps, and I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears. The worst part wasn't the physical pain. It was the fear. The fear that I'd crossed a line I couldn't uncross, that I'd opened a door that wouldn't close. I thought about the man at the party, his knowing smile, the way he handed me that vial like it was a gift. Was this what he meant by the answer to everything? Was this what the woman had felt before the euphoria kicked in? If it was, I didn't understand how anyone could go back for more, but deep down, I already knew the truth, because even through the sickness, through the pain and the terror, I could still hear their voices.
Henry.
Faint like a whisper, carried on the wind, but they were there, and that was enough to keep me hooked. The blaring alarm jolted me awake, its shrill tone slicing through the thick haze in my head. My eyes shot open, and for a moment I was completely disoriented, my mind still stuck in the fog of what I experienced last night. I groaned as I sat up, every muscle in my body protesting. The room was bathed in morning light, too bright and unforgiving, and my head pounded like a drum. Glancing at the clock on the bedside table, I cursed under my breath. I was late. I stumbled out of bed, my legs unsteady beneath me, and made my way to the bathroom. Catching sight of myself in the mirror, I winced. I looked terrible. Dark circles hung under my bloodshot eyes, my skin pale and clammy, and my hair was dishevelled. Splashing cold water on my face, I tried to pull myself together, but it did little to help. My mind raced as I ran through possible excuses. Food poisoning, I muttered to my reflection. No one questions food poisoning. I hurriedly dressed, opting for a clean shirt and tie that I hoped would distract from the wreckage of my face. My usual sharp, confident appearance was gone, replaced by someone who looked like they'd spent the night crawling out of a grave. As I grabbed my briefcase and headed out the door, I rehearsed my story. Sorry I'm late, I muttered under my breath, pacing towards my car. Must have been that sushi last night, you know how it is. Deep down I knew this wasn't sustainable. I couldn't keep this up. Couldn't let my colleagues or anyone else see the cracks forming, but as I slid into the driver's seat, the thought of those voices, of my parents, crept back into my mind. It didn't matter how bad I looked or how sick I felt. If I could just get through today, I could figure out when to try again. Because for the first time in a decade, I'd felt them, seen them, and it was worth everything. Even if it meant it would destroy me. By mid-morning, the nausea and pounding headache had started to fade. Much to my relief, a strong coffee and a greasy breakfast sandwich from the cafe downstairs worked wonders, bringing some colour back into my face and some clarity to my thoughts. I could finally focus without feeling like my head was stuffed with cotton. I threw myself into work, determined to make up for the late start. If I was going to restore my reputation as the firm's rising star, I couldn't afford another slip-up. Every email I sent, every call I made, I had to be perfect, sharp, efficient, and unwaveringly professional. Around lunchtime, my immediate boss, Mr. Carter, strolled by my desk, his trademark easy confidence. A man of charm and connections, he had a knack for making everyone feel like they were part of something important. "Henry, looking better," he said with a nod, his sharp eyes scanning me as if assessing whether I was fit for duty. "Busy tonight?" "No, sir," I said quickly, though I wasn't sure if that was true. "Good. Drinks at Hudson's with some new clients. It'll be good for you to meet them. They're looking for a firm to handle their high-profile cases, and I want them to see the best we got." "Of course," I said, forcing a smile. He clapped me on the shoulder and moved on, leaving me with the sinking realization that tonight was going to be another performance. As the day wore on, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out discreetly, glancing at the screen. Harry. I stared at the name for a moment, hesitating. The last time he'd called, it had been some rambling request for money, or a favour, or something else that reeked of his dependence on me. I didn't have time for that today. I silenced the call and shoved the phone back into my pocket, returning my attention to the client file in front of me. This was where my focus needed to be, not on Harry and his endless spirals. The rest of the day passed in a blur of meetings, phone calls, and paperwork. But I found myself glancing at the clock more often than usual. Each passing minute felt like an eternity. I needed to prove myself tonight, to erase the stain of my tardiness and remind Carter why I was his go-to. As the clock struck 5, I grabbed my briefcase and straightened my tie, ready to head to Hudson's. If I played my cards right, tonight could salvage the shaky start of my day. And maybe, just maybe, it would be enough to keep my mind off what happened last night. At least for a little while. The night had gone surprisingly well. The clients were impressed, laughing at Carter's jokes and nodding along to my contributions about the firm's success in high-profile cases. I even managed to get a genuine laugh out of one of them when I recounted a harmless anecdote from the past trial. It felt like everything was back on track. But then, as the group's chatter faded into the background and I excused myself to the restroom, the mood shifted. Hudson's bathroom was polished and modern, the kind of place that made even washing your hands feel like a luxury. I splashed cold water on my face, glancing up at the mirror to steady myself. The man staring back at me looked better than he had that morning, more composed, more in control. That's when I noticed him. In the corner of the room, leaning casually against the far wall, was the strange man from the party. He wasn't supposed to be here. He was dressed the same as before, sharp, eccentric, almost too polished. His eyes, dark and piercing, met mine in the mirror, and he smiled, that same knowing smile that had haunted me since the night he had handed me the vial. My stomach turned. I gripped the edge of the sink, unsure if it was the alcohol or the sight of him that made my head spin. What are you doing here? I stammered, turning to face him. He stepped away from the wall, his movements deliberate and smooth, like a predator approaching prey. Henry, he said, his voice calm and velvety as it had been before. Fancy seeing you here. This isn't possible, I muttered, shaking my head. Oh, but it is, he said, chuckling softly. I go where I'm needed, and it seems, Henry, that you've been thinking about me. My heart pounded in my chest as I took a step back. Stay away from me, I said, my voice trembling, desperate, my attempt to sound firm. He raised his hands in mock surrender, the smile never leaving his face. Relax, Henry. I'm not here to harm you. Quite the opposite, actually. You've already done enough, I snapped, my mind flashing back to the sickness, the voices, the dreams. Ah, yes. The initial adjustment can be unpleasant, he said, tilting his head. But tell me, Henry, wasn't it worth it? Didn't you feel something extraordinary? Didn't you see them? My breath caught in my throat. He knew somehow. He knew. I don't know what you're talking about, I said, turning back to the sink, desperate to end the conversation. Don't lie to me, he said, his tone soft but firm. You saw them. Your parents. They called you, didn't they? They need you, Henry. I gripped the sink tighter, my knuckles white. Every instinct told me to leave, to run, but I couldn't move. His words held me there, rooted to the spot. Go to hell, I muttered, refusing to look at him. He laughed, a low, unsettling sound that sent chills down my spine. Perhaps, but not before I help you. You've only scratched the surface, Henry. There's so much more you need to discover. So much more you need to feel. You just need to let go. I turned back to face him, but the bathroom was empty. The air was still, and the only sound was the faint murmur of voices from the bar outside. My chest heaved as I leaned against the sink, staring at the spot where he'd just been. Had I imagined it? Was the substance still in my system, messing with my head? I splashed more water on my face, avoiding my own reflection this time. Whatever was happening, I couldn't let it unravel me. Not here. Not now. Steeling myself, I pushed open the bathroom door and rejoined the group, plastering on a smile as if nothing had happened. But deep down, I knew the night had taken a dark turn. He wasn't done with me. When I finally got home, the weight of the day hit me all at once. My apartment felt too quiet, too still, amplifying the unease I couldn't shake since leaving Hudson's. I tossed my keys onto the counter and loosened my tie, trying to convince myself that I wasn't just overtired. The man in the bathroom, it had to be my imagination. I went about my usual routine, clinging to the mundane as if it could ground me. I reheated some leftover pasta, ate it in silence at the kitchen table, and mindlessly scrolled through my phone to avoid thinking too much. But the nagging sense of something being off wouldn't leave. I decided to take a shower, hoping the hot water would wash away the lingering anxiety. Peeling off my work clothes, I tossed my pants onto the laundry hamper, but as they hit the floor, something heavy clinked in the pocket. Frowning, I reached down and felt around. My stomach dropped when my fingers closed around something smooth and cool. Slowly I pulled it out. It was a vial. identical to the one I'd been given at the party. My heart began to race as I stared at it. The faint glow of the liquid inside casting a ghostly light in the dim bathroom. This couldn't be real. I hadn't taken anything home from that party, at least not knowingly. I turned it over in my hands, inspecting it as I might find some clue to explain its sudden appearance. It was the same vial from before. No, I'd used that one. This was full, untouched. My mind scrambled for answers. Did that man slip it in my pocket when I wasn't looking? How? When? I set the vial on the edge of the sink and stepped back as if putting distance between us could weaken its pull. But I couldn't take my eyes off it. I could almost hear his voice again, smooth and persuasive. You've only scratched the surface. A shiver ran down my spine. I grabbed a towel and wrapped it tightly around myself, trying to shake the growing unease of dread. I should throw it away, I told myself. Flush it down the toilet, toss it in the trash, anything to get rid of it. But even as the thought crossed my mind, I hesitated. The memories of my parents, so vivid, so real, flooded back. For a brief moment, I had felt them again, felt their presence in a way I hadn't since they were alive. It was intoxicating, like nothing else in the world. I reached out, my fingers hovering over the vial. My reflection in the mirror caught my eye. I looked tired, worn, and haunted. Don't do it, I thought, but another part of me whispered, what's the harm? Just one more time. The sound of my phone buzzing snapped me out of it. I glanced over and saw Harry's name flashing on the screen. I let it ring out as I stared at the vial. The phone buzzed insistently, Harry's name glaring at me from the screen. I clenched my jaw and snatched it up. What do you want, Harry? I barked before he could even say a word. There was a moment of stunned silence on the other end. You know what? I don't have time for this right now, I snapped, cutting him off before he could respond. Without waiting for an answer, I hung up and tossed the phone onto the couch. My pulse was racing, and I let out a frustrated sigh, rubbing my temples. I grabbed a fresh towel and headed for the shower, desperate to clear my head. On the way I spotted the vial which I left on the bathroom counter. The thought of Harry and his consistent issues made me stare at it. I picked it up and walked to my trash bin and threw it away, whistling as I returned to the shower. Under the scalding water, I tried to scrub the night away, but no amount of soap or steam could erase the thought of Mum and Dad from my mind. When I stepped out, I dried off and walked to the trash can. There it was, sitting at the top of the pile. Now a faint glow illuminated from the liquid barely visible through the trash bag. This is insane, I muttered to myself with a decisive motion. I grabbed the trash bag and tied it shut and carried it to the bin outside. Out of sight, out of mind. Feeling a strange sense of relief, I climbed into bed. The sheets were cool, the room dark and still, but as I lay there staring at the ceiling, my thoughts began to churn. The memory of my parents lingered, warm and vivid, like a movie playing just behind my eyelids. I could still hear their voices, feel their presence. It had been so real. What if I could see them again? The thought was a whisper at first, but it grew louder, more insistent. I turned over, burying my face in the pillow, trying to ignore it. It's not real, I told myself. It's just a drug, just chemicals messing with my brain. But the other voice, the one that had been tempting me since the first vial, wouldn't be silenced. What if it wasn't just chemicals? What if it's something more? Something you need to understand? My heart pounded as I stared into the darkness, the internal battle raging. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I threw off the covers and swung my legs over the side of the bed. My hands trembled as I grabbed my phone for light and padded out to the trash bin. It didn't take long to find it. The bag was still there, untouched, and when I opened it, the vial glowed faintly, like it had been there waiting for me. I held it up, the liquid inside catching the dim light of the moon through the kitchen window. One more time, I whispered to myself. Just one more. I unscrewed the cap, my hands steady, desperate, the adrenaline surging through me, and I tipped the vial to my lips. As the liquid slid down my throat, warmth spread through my chest, but the sensation quickly turned into something much stronger. My vision blurred, the room around me twisting and spinning as if I'd been thrown into a violent tornado. I staggered, gripping the counter to steady myself, but the world kept warping, colours bleeding into one another, sounds distorting into a deafening hum. My heart pounded in my ears, and for a moment, I thought I might pass out. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the chaos stilled. I opened my eyes, gasping for air, and found myself standing in a place I hadn't seen for years. My old house. The familiar walls surrounded me, warm but comforting. The faint hum of the refrigerator, the gentle creak of wooden floorboards, all of it exactly as I remembered. And then, there was the smell. That unmistakable, heart-warming aroma of my mother's cooking. It filled the air, rich and inviting, wrapping around me like a warm embrace. "Is that?" I whispered, my voice trembling. My feet moved before I could think, carrying me towards the kitchen. As I rounded the corner, my breath caught in my throat. There she was, my mother, standing at the stove, humming softly to herself as she stirred a pot. She looked exactly as she had the last time I seen her, right down to the way her hair fell into her face as she worked. "Mum?" I croaked, barely able to speak. She turned to me, smiling warmly, her eyes lighting up like they always did when she saw me.
Henry, there you are. Dinner's almost ready. Go wash up, sweetie.
Her voice was so clear, so real, that it hit me like a punch to the gut. Tears sprang to my eyes as I stepped closer, unsure if I was dreaming, hallucinating, or something else entirely. "Mum?" I said again, my voice cracking. She tilted her head, her smile faltering slightly.
What's wrong, honey? You look like you've seen a ghost.
I couldn't answer. My legs felt weak, and I stumbled towards the kitchen table, gripping the back of the chair for support. Everything about this was impossible, yet it was all here. Real and tangible, in a way I couldn't deny. The clatter of dishes, the sizzle of food on the stove, even the faint ticking of the old wall clock. "Henry!" Another voice called from behind me. I spun around and my heart nearly stopped. It was my dad, standing in the doorway with a newspaper tucked under his arm. His face broke into a grin when he saw me, the kind of grin that used to make everything in the world feel okay. "There's me boy," he said warmly, stepping into the room. "Long day at work?" I couldn't speak. My legs buckled and I sank into the chair, staring at them both as tears streamed down my face. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. But for the life of me, I just couldn't tell the difference anymore. I sat at the table, savouring every bite of my mother's cooking. It was exactly as I remembered. Even better. The flavours exploded on my tongue, transporting me back to a simpler time when I felt whole. Dad told me one of his corny jokes, and I laughed harder than I had in years. Mum rolled her eyes playfully but couldn't hide her smile. For a few hours, it was as if nothing had changed. The weight of the world, the pressures of work, the fractured relationship with Harry, all of it melted away. As we sat there, I leaned back in my chair, basking in the warmth of their presence. "This is perfect," I said softly, my voice tinged with disbelief. Mum reached across the table and patted my hand.
You've been working so hard, Henry. You deserve to rest.
Dad nodded in agreement. "But don't forget to make time for what really matters." The words hung in the air for a moment, and I hesitated before asking, "What about Harry?" At the mention of his name, the atmosphere shifted. The warmth seemed to drain from the room, replaced by an uneasy silence. Mum and Dad exchanged a glance, their smiles fading.
You've got to go now, Henry.
Mum said gently, her tone firm but kind. "Go?" I frowned. "But why? I just got here." "You've got to do what you can," Dad added, his voice lower, more urgent. "Do what you can to come back to us." I opened my mouth to protest, but before I could say a word, the room began to spin again. The comforting smells of dinner disappeared, replaced by the sharp tang of reality. "No! Wait!" I cried out, reaching for them, but they were already gone. I awoke with a jolt, gasping for air. My body felt heavy, my head pounding like a drum. That same feeling returned, hitting me all at once. My stomach churned and my skin was clammy with sweat. I stumbled out of bed, barely making it to the bathroom in time to retch into the sink. The taste of bile lingered in my mouth as I gripped the edge of the counter, staring at my pale reflection in the mirror. "Do what you can," I muttered to myself, the words echoing in my mind. But what did that mean? I groaned, dragging myself back to the bed and collapsing into the mattress. The weight of my body felt unbearable, and my head pounded with a relentless ache. As my vision cleared, I glanced at the clock. "Shit," I muttered. It was almost 2 p.m. Half the day was gone, and my phone was lit up with a string of missed calls and notifications. I grabbed it, squinting at the screen. 5 missed calls from my boss. A few text messages demanding an explanation, and a voicemail that started with, "Henry, you better have a good reason for..." I ended the playback before it could finish, wincing. There was no way I could explain this mess. My mind raced for an excuse, something believable, but not suspicious. I'll just call in sick, I thought. With shaking hands, I dialed the office. My boss picked up almost immediately. "Henry, where the hell..." "I'm really sorry," I interrupted, my voice hoarse and weak. I'm not feeling well. I must have caught something. Food poisoning or the flu. I can barely get out of bed. There was a long pause before my boss sighed. "Fine, but you better be in tomorrow. The firm's reputation is on the line, and we need you focused." "I understand," I replied quickly before hanging up. I tossed the phone aside and rubbed my temples. The pounding in my head showed no signs of easing up, and my body felt like it had been hit by a truck. Desperate for answers, I forced myself to sit up and open my laptop. What the hell did I take? I typed in search terms like hallucinogenic drug side effects, new recreational substances, and strange drug experiences. Dozens of results popped up, everything from personal stories on forums to articles about the latest designer drugs. I read through lists of side effects: nausea, disorientation, vivid dreams, paranoia. Some matched my experience, but none of it fit exactly. Nothing mentioned the overwhelming realism of the visions, the tangible smells, or the voices of the dead. Frustrated, I leaned back in my chair, running a hand through my hair. Then I stumbled upon a forum thread titled Dreamwalkers, the drug that feels like time travel. My pulse quickened as I clicked the link. The thread was filled with cryptic posts. "It's not just a drug, it's a doorway. Saw my grandmother again, she told me things I shouldn't have known. Careful, it's addictive, you'll lose yourself trying to stay there." My stomach churned as I read. One user described seeing their deceased loved ones, like I had. Another claimed they became obsessed, spending their waking hours trying to relive the experience. The post filled with warnings. "It's not worth it. You won't come back the same. Whatever you do, don't take it alone." I stared at the screen, my mind racing. Could this be what I'd taken? How had that strange man even gotten it? And more importantly, why had I ended up with another vial? As I stared at the screen trying to piece together what I had, my phone buzzed on the desk. The sudden noise made me jump. I leaned forward, my heart skipping a beat when I saw the caller ID, unknown number. Hesitating, I hovered my finger over the decline button, but curiosity got the better of me and I swiped to answer. "Hello?" I said cautiously. A familiar smooth voice came through the line, sending a chill down my spine. Henry. I trust you enjoyed your little trip." My grip on the phone tightened. "Who is this?" "You know who I am." The man's tone was light, almost amused. "I see you've already discovered the side effects of my little gift." My throat went dry. "What the hell did you give me?" The man chuckled softly. "Something extraordinary. Something that lets you see what most can only dream of. and it seems that you've taken a liking to it quite well. Why did you give it to me? I demanded, my voice shaking. What do you want? I simply wanted to introduce you to its potential, the man replied. But let's not waste time. You've had your sample, Henry. If you want more, I'm afraid this time it won't be free. My stomach twisted. More? I didn't even ask for the first dose. And yet you took it, the man said smoothly. Twice, if I'm not mistaken. That vial in your pocket wasn't an accident. It wasn't an opportunity. It's just something that you seem to embrace quite readily. My mind raced. I thought about the visions, the intoxicating warmth of being with my parents again. It was more than a drug. It was a doorway, like the foreign post had said. But at what cost? How much? I asked before I could stop myself. The man chuckled again, this time darker, more sinister. That depends on what your parents' smiles are worth to you, Henry. Their voices, their love. Think on it. You know how to find me. The line went dead. I sat frozen, the phone still pressed to my ear. My thoughts were a chaotic mess of fear, anger and temptation. The sick feeling in my stomach had nothing to do with the substance this time. I sat at my desk, tapping my fingers anxiously. The rhythm was erratic, my nails clicking against the wood like a clock ticking down to some inevitable decision. I stared at the laptop screen, the foreign post still glowing in front of me. Every warning, every cryptic tale, every mention of addiction and obsession seemed to scream at me. But all I could think about was the warmth of my mother's smile, the sound of my father's laugh, the way it felt to be back in the house. My fingers stopped tapping. Slowly I leaned back in my chair, running a hand over my face. I can't handle this, I thought. I'm not like Harry. I'm in control. The thought rang hollow in my mind. Before I could stop myself, I grabbed my jacket and wallet. As I left the apartment, I told myself it was just to get answers, to confront the strange man and demand an explanation, but deep down, I already knew what I was going to do. By the time I arrived at Hudson's, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the street. I hesitated at the entrance, my hand hovering over the door handle. What am I doing? I thought. But the memory of my parents' voices pushed me forward. I stepped inside, my eyes scanning the crowded bar for any sign of the man. When I didn't see him in the main room, I made my way to the restroom, my heartbeat hammering in my chest. The fluorescent lights flickered above me as I pushed open the door. The restroom was empty, save for my own reflection staring back at me in the cracked mirror. Where are you? I muttered under my breath, my voice barely audible. Then I saw it, a small note taped to the corner of the mirror written in elegant script. It read, "You came back. I knew you would. Meet me where the night whispers." My stomach dropped as I read the words. I had no idea what they meant, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I pushed open the door of Hudson's and stepped out into the cool evening air, my frustration bubbling just beneath the surface. I felt like an idiot, chasing shadows and riddles left by a man I didn't even know. My hands were stuffed deep in my pockets as I paced along the sidewalk, muttering to myself. What am I even doing? Chasing cryptic notes in a restroom like some detective in a bad noir film, I grumbled. As I turned to cross the street, something caught my eye, a neon marquee glowing faintly in the distance. Across the way, the letters of an old cinema sign flickered sporadically, as if barely clinging to life. Now showing where the night whispers. I froze in my tracks, my stomach twisting into knots. The words were impossible to ignore, too coincidental to be random. The universe was practically screaming at me to follow this trail. I stared at the theatre for a long moment, my mind racing. Was this some kind of setup? Was the man watching me, guiding me like a puppet on a string? Shaking my head, I let out a bitter laugh. This is insane, I muttered. Absolutely insane. But my feet were already moving, carrying me across the street and towards the faded cinema. Want to know what happens next? Tune into our next episode, The Devils Elixir Part 2, on the Pages of Darkness podcast.